wind howled across the North Atlantic. Somewhere beneath the gray waves, men were dying in silence. May 1943. For 4 long years, the U-boats of Nazi Germany ruled the Atlantic like wolves in the dark. Convoys burned, sailors vanished, and Britain's lifeline to the New World hung by a thread. But in just 31 days, everything changed. 41 U-boats were lost. More than 1,870 German sailors went down with them. It was the single greatest defeat in the history of submarine warfare. The Germans called it Schwarzer Mai, Black May, a month when the hunters became the hunted, when the ocean itself turned against them. The sea that once hid them now betrayed every move. Allied aircraft roamed the skies. Radar pierced the night. And beneath the waves, the wolf packs began to die. This is the story of how courage met technology, and how, in the cold Atlantic of 1943, the might of a nation drowned in silence. In early 1943, the U-boat crews of Nazi Germany were legends. They were young, confident, and adored at home. Posters across Berlin and Hamburg showed smiling sailors in black caps standing proudly beside their steel sharks. They were the heroes of the Atlantic, the gray wolves of Admiral Doenitz. For years they had been unstoppable. Operating from concrete pens in occupied France, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, Brest, they slipped out each night into the black Atlantic. Their mission was simple: strangle Britain. If they could cut the convoy routes from North America, the island would starve before the year was out. Doenitz believed in mathematics as much as in strategy. He called it the tonnage war. Every merchant ship sunk meant fewer weapons, fewer tanks, fewer meals for Britain. And the numbers seemed to prove him right. In 1942 alone, U-boats destroyed more than 8 million tons of Allied shipping. Convoys burned from Newfoundland to Sierra Leone. For the sailors who watched torpedoes streak through the night, the ocean itself felt like an enemy. By the winter of 1942, more than 100 U-boats prowled the Atlantic at once, the largest submarine force the world had ever seen. They attacked in groups called Rudel, wolf packs. One boat spotted a convoy, called the others by radio, and together they swarmed like predators on wounded prey. It was brutal, mechanical efficiency. Ships vanished in minutes, lifeboats drifted in the dark. The Atlantic had become a graveyard, and the wolves believed no one could challenge them. In Germany, Doenitz was hailed as a genius. He spoke of his submariners as an elite brotherhood, disciplined, pure, and loyal to the Führer. He promised Hitler that his U-boats would bring Britain to its knees. And for a time, it looked like he might be right. Each month, the tonnage graphs at Kriegsmarine headquarters climbed higher. Each return to Lorient brought champagne, medals, and celebration. But deep, beneath the statistics, the first cracks had already begun to show. Submarines that once hunted in darkness now found the ocean uncomfortably bright. Allied convoys were no longer helpless. They sailed with new escorts, destroyers bristling with radar and sonar, and aircraft that could see beyond the horizon. The safe zones Doenitz once relied on were shrinking mile by mile. Still, the U-boat commanders refused to believe it. They had survived storms, mines, and depth charges. To them, the Atlantic was a living thing that obeyed no one except the wolves who mastered it. They didn't yet realize that, even as they prepared for another round of hunting in spring 1943, the ocean itself was turning against them. Invisible waves of radar were already sweeping the surface, and codebreakers in a quiet English estate were listening to every message they sent. The wolves were heading out for another hunt, but this time they were sailing straight into a trap built from mathematics, radio waves, and light. The ocean doesn't change in a day, but in early 1943 something invisible began to move beneath its surface. While German submariners toasted victories in their concrete pens, Their enemies were quietly reinventing the science of war. It started with sound, radio, and light. Weapons no one could see. British and American scientists had learned to bend physics to their will. The new ASV Mark III radar, operating at 10 centimeters, could pierce fog and darkness to find a submarine's shadow on the sea. It no longer mattered if the U-boats sailed at night or hid beneath clouds. To Allied aircraft, the ocean was now transparent. Next came HFDF, high-frequency direction finding. Each time a U-boat sent a radio report to Doenitz's command, Allied ships triangulated the signal within seconds. What had once been a weapon of coordination, the Wolfpack's lifeline, became a beacon revealing their every move. And on land, in the quiet English countryside, the men and women of Bletchley Park were unlocking the secrets of the Enigma code. Every encrypted message from a U-boat now appeared within hours on the desks of British admirals. Convoys no longer wandered blind through the Atlantic. They moved through corridors of safety drawn by intelligence and mathematics. But perhaps the greatest change of all came from the air. For years, the Germans had believed there was one place beyond Allied reach, the mid-Atlantic Gap, that vast, empty stretch where no aircraft could patrol. Doenitz built his entire strategy on that assumption. It was a fatal mistake. In March 1943, the Americans introduced a new machine, the B-24 Liberator Very Long-Range Bomber. Stripped of armor and bomb bays, fitted with extra fuel tanks, it could patrol for 16 hours and cover nearly 900 miles from base. The gap vanished overnight. Now, wherever a U-boat surfaced to charge its batteries, the droning sound of engines might already be approaching over the horizon. And with radar guiding them, those aircraft carried a new weapon, depth charges fused for shallow detonation. They didn't need to sink the submarine. A single blast near the surface could tear open a pressure hull like paper. The Germans were fighting the last war, one of sight and sound. The Allies were fighting the next, one of signals and science. By the spring of 1943, a convoy crossing the Atlantic looked like a floating fortress. Destroyers with sonar swept the depths. Corvettes with HFDF antennas listened for whispers on the air. And above them, the gray shapes of liberators circled endlessly, watching. Meanwhile, in Paris, Doenitz studied reports that made no sense. More and more submarines were failing to return. Messages from commanders ended mid-sentence. He blamed luck, bad weather, fate, anything but the possibility that the battlefield itself had changed. What he didn't know was that the Allies now saw every move his fleet made before it even began. The balance of the Atlantic was tipping. The wolves were still out there, still hungry, still brave. But in the invisible war of radio, radar, and mathematics, the tide had already turned, and the ocean they once ruled had become their enemy. It began with fog, cold, blinding fog rolling across the North Atlantic in the first days of May, 1943. Inside that mist, the greatest duel of the Battle of the Atlantic was about to begin. The convoy, Owens 5. 43 merchant ships lumbered westward toward Halifax, loaded with grain, fuel, and ammunition. Their escorts, destroyers, corvettes, and a single frigate, moved like sheepdogs around a herd too large to protect. Somewhere out there, in the gray void beyond visibility, waited 40 German U-boats. The Wolfpack had come again. For 3 nights, the Atlantic erupted. Torpedoes flashed beneath the waves. Merchantmen burned like floating furnaces. Allied sailors fought fires while explosions tore the night apart. On the surface, German captains stalked through sleet and thunder, convinced victory was close. But the ocean had changed. Then came the fog, a wall of gray. Every time a U-boat surfaced to reload its torpedo tubes, radar found them. Depth charges rained down through the mist, steel barrels filled with torpex, detonating in chains of underwater thunder. By dawn, 6 submarines were gone. 41 men were pulled from the freezing sea. Hundreds more sank with their boats. It was the first time in the war that the hunters had suffered more losses than the hunted. When the surviving U-boats turned home through the Bay of Biscay, they entered a new nightmare. The Luftwaffe no longer ruled the skies there. The Allies did. Patrol aircraft, British Sunderlands, American B-24 Liberators, roamed the horizon day and night. What had once been a safe route to port became what the submariners called the corridor of death. At dawn, the drone of aircraft, engines sent men scrambling to dive. But even under the surface, safety was an illusion. The new radar could still track the submarine's wake, a faint line of bubbles betraying its path. When the Liberators dropped their depth charges, the sea itself seemed to explode. Oil, air, and fragments of steel erupted from the water, followed by a single spreading slick, the grave of another crew. In that 1 week, 10 U-boats were destroyed in the Bay of Biscay alone. Those who made it back to France described the ocean as haunted, a place where the sky hunted the sea, and the sea answered with silence. By mid-May, Doenitz tried again. He assembled 20 submarines to attack convoy SC-130, a slow line of merchant ships crawling eastward from Newfoundland. The attack began on May 17th, but this time the wolves were charging into a trap. The convoy's escort included destroyers fitted with the latest radar and Hedgehog mortars, weapons that could hurl explosives hundreds of feet forward instead of dropping them behind. Above them, aircraft from the escort carrier HMS Biter prowled continuously. On the first night, U-boat commanders saw flares lighting the sky, not distress flares, but Allied aircraft marking their positions. Depth charges struck in perfect rhythm. U-952, U-438, U-226, gone. Others surfaced amid boiling white water, their hulls split, their crews clinging to wreckage before slipping beneath the waves. For the first time, not a single merchant ship was lost. The Admiralty's report summed it in one line: the pack was destroyed before it struck. By the 3rd week of May, the Atlantic was filled with wreckage, lifebelts, oil, and silence. At Allied command in London, the reports came in daily. U-boat sunk, U-boat missing, U-boat overdue. 41 submarines gone in a single month. 1,800 trained men, most of the Kriegsmarine's elite, vanished without trace. The losses were greater than the total number of U-boats sunk in the previous 6 months combined. In Lorient and Saint-Nazaire, families waited for crews that never returned. The docks were lined with empty moorings and painted banners turned gray by salt. For the first time, the men of the U-boat arm felt what their victims had felt: helplessness. At BDU headquarters in Paris, Admiral Doenitz stared at a map covered with tiny red pins, each marking a lost boat. He had always believed courage could overcome technology. Now, he faced a truth that no amount of will could change. The ocean, once his weapon, had become his enemy. On May 24, 1943, he gave the order no one expected to hear: suspend all operations in the North Atlantic. Withdraw the fleet. It was the quiet end of the Wolfpack Empire. The month that had begun in fog ended in silence, and the Atlantic, for the first time in 4 years, belonged to someone else. The order came quietly, just a few lines of code, transmitted from BDU headquarters in Paris to every submarine still afloat. Suspend operations. Return to base. No speeches, no fanfare, only silence crackling through the radio waves that had once carried words of triumph. For the U-boat men, it felt like the ocean itself had gone still. One by one, the surviving boats limped home. Their decks were scarred, their paint burned away by salt and explosions. The smell of diesel, oil, and sweat clung to the steel. Inside, the men moved like ghosts, hollow-eyed, unshaven, their uniforms stiff with salt. Every mile toward France felt heavier than the last. When they reached the pens at Lorient, there was no band waiting, no cheering crowd. Only officers with clipboards and the echo of boots on concrete. Each submarine returned to an empty berth once shared by comrades, now resting somewhere beneath the waves. The sea smelled of rust and diesel, but mostly of absence. The steel pens that had once echoed with victory songs now rang with the clang of hammers repairing what could still be saved. In those first weeks of June 1943, the U-boat bases resembled morgues. Crews spoke in whispers. The walls were lined with black-bordered photographs of men who would never return, captains who had once been heroes, now names carved into silence. Admiral Doenitz, standing in his command bunker, refused to call it defeat. He told his staff that the withdrawal was temporary, a tactical regrouping. But even he could not disguise the weight in his eyes. His great tonnage war, the campaign meant to starve Britain, had turned against him. For every ship the Germans sank, the Allies were now building 10 more. The factories in America's heartland worked day and night, launching new Liberty ships faster than U-boats could sink them. In his private notes, Doenitz wrote only one line that revealed the truth. "Our losses are unsustainable. The sea has become transparent." For the men who returned from patrol, that transparency felt like betrayal. The ocean that once protected them now offered nowhere to hide. They had spent years mastering silence, listening for propellers, breathing between depth charges, trusting the deep to keep them alive. Now, it was as if the deep itself had turned them away. One survivor later recalled, "When we surfaced at night, we used to feel free. Now we felt naked. The sky was watching us." In the weeks after the retreat, dozens of submarines were pulled from service, stripped for repairs that would never be completed. Veteran crews were reassigned or sent home on leave that felt like exile. They no longer ruled the sea. They had become its relics. The Wolfpack was gone. The great empire beneath the waves had fallen without a single decisive battle, undone not by bravery or cowardice, but by science, patience, and the cold arithmetic of war. And as the tide of June rolled in, the harbors of France echoed only with the sound of water dripping from rusted hulls, the slow, rhythmic heartbeat of a fleet that no longer hunted. In the years that followed, historians would call May 1943 the turning point of the Atlantic War. For the Allies, it marked the beginning of victory. For the Kriegsmarine, it marked the beginning of extinction. The numbers told the story with brutal simplicity. In 1 month, 41 U-boats destroyed. Over 1,800 men lost, trained specialists, veterans, the pride of Germany's Navy. The same month, Allied losses dropped to their lowest since 1939. It was as if the tide itself had changed allegiance. From that moment, the U-boats never recovered. They still fought bravely, ambushing convoys, striking at night. But the old fear was gone. The Allied convoys no longer felt hunted. They felt armed, alert, and unstoppable. Radar, sonar, aircraft, and intelligence had fused into one seamless system, a machine of detection that no human courage could outrun. By late 1943, Doenitz's dream of a submarine blockade was dead. He shifted his hopes to new technologies. The Type 21 electro-boot, faster, deeper, silent. But it came too late. When the first prototypes entered the war itself was already ending. And yet, even in defeat, the U-boat crews carried a strange kind of honor. They had fought in conditions no soldier on land could imagine, sealed inside iron tubes for weeks, breathing recycled air, never knowing if the next depth charge would be the last sound they'd ever hear. Most were barely 20 years old. They did not fight for glory or conquest anymore, only for each other and for the hope of coming home. Out of more than 39,000 men who served aboard German submarines, 28,000 never returned. a casualty rate of over 70%. No other branch of any military suffered losses so high. Today, the coordinates of Black May, 47 degrees north, 19 degrees west, mark no memorial, no monument. Only the cold Atlantic, stretching endlessly to the horizon. But deep below, the wrecks still rest, silent, corroded, and eternal. 7 decades later, they remain where they fell, guarded by the same sea that once betrayed them. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of Black May, that technology may win wars, but it can never silence the human cost. Each blip on a radar screen, each explosion in the deep, was a heartbeat that stopped, a young man who believed the ocean would keep him safe. In May 1943, the ocean changed sides. The wolves of the deep were gone, and the Battle of the Atlantic, the longest, coldest battle of the Second World War, finally began to end. Would you rather command a U-boat or chase one from the sky? Tell us, which side would you choose?